So, hello and welcome to Music Theory with Matthew. This is the first of 6 sessions that will take place throughout the summer. I have some announcements. I've said some already, but we're going to say them again. So, in order to have the best viewing experience, we're all muted and our cameras are turned off. And I just taught you about the hide non-video participants feature. So if you have any trouble throughout the session, I can help you out. I have control on my end, so do not worry about any of that. So throughout this section, we do encourage questions. So if Matthew is talking about something and you have a question about it or you want further explanation, here are the couple ways that you can ask a question. What you can do is you can, if you would like to ask Matthew the question personally, what you will do is you will type your question in the chat. At the bottom of your screen, there's a little chat button, and you will type it in the public chat. So you'll send it to everybody. And then when I see that pop up, when we come to a good breaking point in the session, I will call on you to ask the question. So what you'll do is you'll unmute yourself, you'll turn on your camera if you would like, and you can verbally ask Matthew the question. You guys can talk about it. And then once you're done asking your question, you will turn your camera back off and mute yourself again. The other way that you can do this is if you don't feel comfortable asking Matthew the question out loud in public, you can personally chat to me. So in the chat, you can change who you're sending the chat to, and you can send it directly to me, Rachel Hagemeyer. Hi, Brandon. I'm going to turn your camera off for you. And you can send it personally to me, and then I will ask the question for you. So those are the 2 ways that you can ask questions throughout this. So make sure you are muted. So there should be a red slash through your microphone. Do not click that again. Make sure that there is a red slash through the microphone. So like I said, this session is being recorded. It's not for public use. It's only for people who registered for this event and for our public archive and for our archives. So it's not for public use. So this, like I said at the beginning, is the first event of this scale and this kind. So bear with us as we figure some stuff out. But we're so happy that you're with us today. We are able to offer these programs for free, which is very, very cool. So if you feel so inclined, the next time you reserve one of your tickets for one of these online programs, give us a couple dollars of donations, kind of a Met pay what you can situation, and we would really appreciate that. Next week, same day on Wednesday, we actually have a couple more online programming sessions happening. At 1 p.m., we have a scenario planning for teachers, a professional development session. And then again at 6 p.m., we have another just fun educational session. It's actually going to be with Matthew again. It's going to be a Ask You Anything. So we get to ask Matthew any questions we want, which is super exciting and very cool. So without further ado, I'll turn this over to Matthew and we'll get started.
Thank you, Rachel. And thank you again, everybody, for being a part of this. It's really, I've never really done anything like this before, but I'm extremely excited to be doing it and to be giving you guys, hopefully, a basic introduction to the world of what we call music theory, and looking at a few pieces along the way, in the hopes that the next time you are in the concert hall, the next time we are all in the concert hall together, which hopefully will be sooner rather than later, that you will hear a piece of music and understand just a little bit about what's going on in that piece, understand just a little bit more about what the composer is doing, what the composer did to create something interesting, intriguing, something that makes you want to keep listening. And music theory is something that can help us do that. Really, theory is essentially the set of rules, a set of rules that is deduced over time about how music is composed. Every human culture throughout history has had music. It's a basic part of who we are as human beings. And every culture's music works a little bit differently, but you can find writing accompanying the music about how that music works for many, many, many cultures around the world. And of course, most notably, what we call Western art music, what you may know as classical music, the type of music that we hear in the concert hall. And obviously, we've had so much written about our Western art music. But the practice of music theory dates back to ancient times. We don't know what a lot of ancient music sounded like, but for instance, the ancient Greeks had music. We know they had music. If any of you have ever read or possibly seen a Greek tragedy, such as Oedipus Rex or Antigone or something like that, you may remember that one of the characters in a Greek tragedy is called the chorus. And we actually have much reason to believe that that would have actually been sung. Just like a chorus in an opera or a musical, the chorus of the Greek tragedy was meant to be sung. So the Greeks had music, and we don't really know a lot about what it actually sounded like. But we know that they had music and that they wrote about it. The Greeks wrote music theory. An example of a famous Greek theorist was Pythagoras, the same guy who came up with the theorem for finding the area of a right triangle, that a squared plus b squared equals c squared. The length of the hypotenuse and the area of a right triangle. If you remember that from high school geometry class. Same guy who did that wrote about music theory. So it's a field of study that's been around forever, since probably the beginning of when humans started to write things down. It's important to remember that the theory comes from the music. And the composers wrote their music, and then theorists analyzed it and saw what composers were doing and came up with a set of rules that described how this music was put together. Composers didn't already have the rules and then try to follow them, at least at first. The theory came after the music. And music has evolved over time because composers break the rules. If no composer ever dared to break the rules of music theory once they were codified, all we would have today is Gregorian chant. That's sort of what we consider to be the beginning of Western art music as we know it, was Gregorian chant that was heard in the monasteries and churches of the Middle Ages. And they wrote their chants. Rules were derived from the chants that were written. And then eventually, some composers said, hey, I want to try to do something a little bit different. And so rather than just having a single line of chant, we had 2 voices and 3 voices. Eventually, we have Renaissance motets. Eventually, we have fugues in the Baroque period. And ultimately, symphonies, string quartets, sonatas, and the like in the classical period and beyond. The music, the media, the structures in music that are still being used today. So I'm going to tell you over the next 6 weeks a little bit about the rules of music theory. And in particular, we're going to focus on the theory of music from what we call the classical period. As I mentioned, we call all this music that we hear in the concert hall classical music. But what theorists and music historians call the classical period of music, really, we're talking 1750, which is the year that Johann Sebastian Bach died, Bach being the most notable of the Baroque composers. So 1750 until about 1820 to 1830. By 1830, we're in what we call the Romantic period. And so we're going to really focus on the theory of the classical period. But we'll touch a little bit on some Romantic pieces. And hopefully you'll see, once you have a basic understanding of the rules of the music from the classical period, you can see how the composers of the Romantic period chose to break those rules in ways that we find interesting and intriguing, and things that composers do that make us smile. Oftentimes, it's because they're toying with our expectations in a way. They're not doing exactly what we expect as listeners. And so I find that once you know the rules of the classical period, it's really fun to see how they were broken in later music. So, the classical period, 3 big composers we're going to talk about whose music features large in this period: Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, Joseph Haydn, and Ludwig van Beethoven. 3 composers who I'm sure all of you have heard of. We play their music all the time in the symphony. We love their music so much. And fortunately for us in the world of music theory, their music and that of their contemporaries works extremely well for the type of music theory and music analysis that we're going to do. So that's a little bit of a laying the groundwork for where we're going to get. And I'm going to start a slideshow here. Give me a moment while I start sharing my screen. Oh, Rachel?
Yes.
Can you please enable screen sharing?
I can. Yours should be good.
Great. Thank you. All right. So, in order to get to the point where we can talk about pieces of music and see how a piece of music is put together, we're going to deconstruct the music all the way down to square one. So I have a little chart here with varying font sizes to give you a basic idea of the layers that build on each other to put together pieces of music. So at the top in big letters, we have a whole piece. This could be a symphony, even an opera, maybe a concerto, the large scale forms that we hear in the concert hall, the thing that will be listed in the program, Symphony No. 1 in C major by Ludwig van Beethoven, the whole piece. Pieces, not all pieces, but many pieces are divided into smaller sections called movements. A classical symphony, for instance, often has 4 movements. Some have fewer, some have more, but most of them have 4 movements. A concerto often has 3 movements, same thing. Some have more, some have fewer, some may only have 1, but many pieces divided into other large-scale forms called movements. Each movement can be divided into smaller sections in which composers divide it so that they can structure it. They can structure their ideas as opposed to just one long stream of consciousness. Sections are made up of phrases. A melody or a melody and its counterpart. Phrases are the oftentimes 4 or 8 measure units that are put together to make the sections. Going even smaller, we have a measure. But measures are what divides the music up at rhythmically or meter-wise at the smallest level. And oftentimes we'll see, always we will see the time signature of a piece, which is something we'll deal with later, which tells us how many beats are in each measure. So a measure is made up of beats, and the notes are structured against one another from what we call intervals, which we're going to get to very, very shortly. And finally, of course, we have the smallest unit of music, a note, a single musical note. So that's sort of the hierarchy of where we're going. We're going to start at the very beginning, a very good place to start, as Julie Andrews famously said once. So those of you who have a musical background, bear with me here for the next little while, because I have to assume that there are at least a reasonable number of you out there who have little or no musical background. So we're going to start from the very beginning, just go on, do a little overview of what we're talking about, of how music is constructed. So starting from our notes, we have 12 notes. That is it. No more, no less. 12 distinct pitches that we are working with when putting together music. They are laid out here on your screen as they would be laid out on a piano. This is what we call one octave of a piano. I'll just play them once. We name them after letters of the alphabet, A through G. C is often used as the starting note when we're first introducing things for various reasons, which we'll get to in a little while. So don't be surprised that A isn't the very first note that you see on the left side of your screen. But we name our notes A through G. Those are the main notes, 7 notes that you see there. Then we have 5 other notes, the black keys, which are the sharp or flat notes. So I'm just going to play them through once so you get an idea of what they sound like in your head. Starting from the far left corner of the page. This is C, C sharp or D flat, D, D sharp or E flat, E, F, F sharp or G flat, G, G sharp or A flat, A sharp or B flat, and B. The next note, we come back to C. It's the same note, except higher than where we started, what we say an octave higher. Here's the low one, here's the high one. You can hear they're the same note, just one is lower, one is higher. And we put together a string of these octaves to create all of the musical notes that are available to us. So here's an example, an 88-key, standard 88-key piano keyboard. Some of you probably didn't know piano has 88 keys. There's a nice bit of trivia for you. You can see it just repeats over and over again. We start at the far left this time with our A. When it gets to the next A, starts over again. So 12 notes in different octaves that are lower or higher than one another, but the notes sound equivalent other than what range they are in. Now, music notation, a little bit about how we write down our music. I mentioned earlier, every world culture has music. Every people has music. Not everybody wrote it down. Many, many cultures, their music is an oral or aural tradition that is passed down from one generation to another. But in the Western tradition that we play in the concert hall, we've been writing down our music for centuries. This, what you see on your screen right now, is an early example of how music was written. And it's something that probably all of you know, the Dies Irae from the Missa pro Defunctis, the Mass for the Dead, better known as the Requiem Mass. You've heard it by itself. You've heard it quoted by many, many composers throughout music history. Anyone who was at the Saint-Saëns Organ Symphony concert back in January may feel like another lifetime ago, as it does for me, but Saint-Saëns quoted the Dies Irae a lot in that piece. Sounds like this. Dies Irae, Dies Illa. And as you can see, it's written down to show someone who somehow had never heard it before, this is how you sing it. Now, this was done on a 4-line staff. Today, we use a 5-line staff. Staff is 5 lines. The notes that appear towards the bottom of the staff are going to be lower than the notes that appear towards the top. Notes that are close together to one another on the staff are going to sound closer together to one another when you hear them. Now, we add to the staff so that we know which notes we're looking at. We add what we call a clef. And the 2 clefs that we're going to be dealing with principally for our purposes are the treble clef and the bass clef. The treble clef is this wonderful loopy little symbol that we put at the left-hand side of our staff at the beginning of each line of music that we're looking at. It's also called a G clef because if you start at the bottom, if you start at the little dot at the bottom and follow the line up and around the loop surrounds where the note G is going to be printed on the staff. And 2 great mnemonic devices that I learned from my wonderful piano teacher growing up, Irina Minovich, who I owe much of my musical heritage and training to up until age 16. She taught me these 2 wonderful mnemonic devices which have never failed in helping me to remember where the notes go on the staff. For the spaces of the staff, the notes S, A, C, E are the 4 spaces, starting from the bottom space going to the top, and it spells the word face. So F-A-C-E, face, going from bottom to top, and on the lines of the staff, E, G, B, D, F, every good boy does fine. This is very standard mnemonics for the staff, and hopefully, if you don't read music already, I don't expect that you're going to become an expert at it by the end of our time together over the next several sessions, but at least you may be able to, you've been exposed to it and you can at least have a general idea of it. The other clef we're using is the bass clef or the F clef. Similarly to the treble clef or G clef, it's called the F clef because these 2 dots, as well as the big dot at the beginning of the swoosh, it almost looks like a very fancy Nike swoosh that's vertical instead of horizontal. At the dot at the end of the swoosh, along with the 2 dots that surround a line, that line is the note F. So, mnemonic devices for the bass clef, starting from the bottom. All cows eat grass, A, C, E, G. And for the lines, G, B, D, F, A. Great big dogs fight animals. A little bit of a morbid one there, but it's always helped me to remember it. So, treble clef, bass clef. We can put these clefs one on top of another and get what we call a grand staff. The bottom line, you see our treble clef on top, our bass clef on bottom. The bottom line is the G at the bottom of the bass clef, great big dogs fight animals. And the top line of the treble clef is going to be an F. Every good boy does fine. The note in the middle is what we call middle C, which is sort of the middle note for the pitches that you're going to typically hear in a piece of classical music. The notes above that are considered treble notes. The notes below that, bass notes. Middle C, this pitch right here, that divides our bass notes from our treble notes and our bass clef from treble clef on a grand staff. The grand staff covers just shy of 3 octaves when printed. This low G is here, the bottom line of the bass clef. And the top line of the treble clef is this F here. So we have, that's the first octave, that's the second, and we almost get to a third, but not quite. But nonetheless, the grand staff is a wonderfully useful tool for notating music, particularly as it is used to notate piano music. Now, what do we do when we need to write notes that are above or below the capabilities of the staff? Because it would not be so great musically if we could only use 3 octaves minus a little bit to write our music. In this case, we use what we call ledger lines. And essentially, you just keep counting up, keep going up the scale from where you stopped, and keep adding lines on top. In this case, you only add a line when you need to use that note. We're not going to actually add full lines that go across the page, only a line that goes with the note that you're trying to do. So going up from F, that's the top line. Every good boy does fine. There's our top line. G, A, B, C, D, E, F. Just keep adding lines as needed. You can add them below the staff as well, going down D, C, B, A, G, F, E. Works the same way with the bass clef. Now, if we're on a grand staff, going below the treble clef or above the bass clef, you would simply put it on the other staff of the grand staff. However, the piano and the harp are among the only instruments that you're going to regularly see in an orchestra that use the grand staff. So for the rest of the instruments, which were affectionately called by one of my grad school professors one-liners, they can read ledger lines both above and below the staff that they're reading. So that's sort of a brief introduction to music notation. We'll go back to our piano once that I showed before. And now below it, I have placed the corresponding notes and how they are, where they are placed on our treble clef staff. So starting from middle C, once again, we have C, C sharp or D flat, D, D sharp or E flat, E, F, F sharp or G flat, G, G sharp or A flat, A sharp or B flat, and B. And then when we get to C, we start over from where we started. Okay, I saw a couple of notifications in the chat box. Rachel, if there are any questions, this would be a great place to take a few.
A couple people were just pointing out that good boys do fine always seems a little less morbid than what was yours about dogs fighting animals.
Great big dogs fight animals.
I think the chat agrees that good boys do fine always is a little less morbid.
I suppose. I learned great big dogs way back in 1996 or thereabouts when I started taking piano from Irina.
I guess
so. Yeah.
I think you can keep on going though. I think we've.
Also, hey, little boys are like attracted to fighting and strength and all that good stuff. I guess maybe she had a different one for girls. I don't know.
Oh my goodness.
Okay, so moving forward, the notes that we use are sort of the one-dimensional. If we're going to use another geometry reference, the notes are sort of our one dimension. Each one individually, taken by itself, is sort of just like a point on a graph, one dimension. Now, to go from one dimension to two-dimensional, in geometry, we put 2 points on the graph and we connect them with a line. So to go in music, a similar thing, we have our intervals. An interval is simply the distance between two notes. As with the notes, we have 12 notes and we have 12 intervals. So I'm going to go through the intervals here and give you a tune for each one that hopefully all of you have heard that will help you remember the interval. I learned these back in freshman music theory at Brown University. So there are a few other fellow Brunonians here this evening. I'm sure if you took Mark Steinbach's theory class, you've probably heard some of these same things or something similar to this. But here are our 12 intervals that we're working with to put music together in a two-dimensional fashion. First, we have the minor second. This is the smallest interval. We're going to start from C for all of these, just since we've been doing that all along. And it's where we go from C to D flat. The most famous use of this interval was by the illustrious film composer John Williams in his score to Jaws, the main theme. The Jaws theme, the minor second, when played together, it's a very crunchy sounding interval because the notes are the closest together that any two notes will be. It's not an interval that you're going to hear a ton of harmonically. It's not going to be used so much like that, but you will hear it used in melodies. Moving on to the major second. This is the first interval we hear in Happy Birthday. Happy birthday. You got it going up and going down. Played together, it sounds a little bit like this. Still pretty dissonant, not nearly as dissonant as the minor second. Next one up is the minor third. It's the first interval in Greensleeves, also known as the Christmas carol, What Child Is This? What child is this? What child? Like that. Played together, it sounds like this. It's not a grating or dissonant sound, but it's still a dark sound. And the minor third, you see on a concert program that a symphony that's going to be played that evening is in a minor key. Beethoven, Symphony No. 5 in C minor. If you see that a piece is going to be played in a minor key, the minor third is the interval that makes a piece minor, that makes the key minor. Like that. The major third is the next one up. Two ways to remember this one. The ascending major third, I have a picture of a campfire here because one of the great all-time campfire songs, Kumbaya, Kumbaya. First two notes of Kumbaya are a major third. Descending, it's the first two notes of the Westminster chime. Similarly to the minor third, if you see a piece is going to be in a major key on a concert program, the major third is what makes that piece a major key. Next up, we have the perfect fourth. Now we're getting towards the middle of our octave, the middle of the notes that we use. And so the fourth is not considered a major or a minor interval, but we call it a perfect interval. The piece that most defines the perfect fourth is Here Comes the Bride. Here comes the bride. Like that. Some of you may know this, but others may not. Here Comes the Bride was actually written by the great, in my opinion, the greatest of all opera composers, Richard Wagner, for his opera Lohengrin. It happens towards the very beginning of Act 3 of that opera. The next one is the very middle of our octave, the tritone. This is considered to be the most dissonant interval in all of music. Although I would argue that the minor second would give it a run for its money. It was considered so dissonant for so many years that they called it, at least in the world of the church and church music, they called it the diabolus in musica, the devil in the music. It was absolutely forbidden for composers to write a tritone for many, many, many years. But of course, eventually the rules get broken, and now we see them all over music. Two ways to remember. It sounds like this. Any of you have ever traveled to Europe and heard a police car go by, especially in Germany, some of the Western European countries? The siren often sounds something like that. If you've ever seen the musical West Side Story, there are two wonderful examples from the great Leonard Bernstein in this wonderful American musical. The first one, Tony, the main male protagonist, sings, Maria, I just kissed a girl named Maria, Maria, Maria. And then we also have, during the fight between the Sharks and the Jets, we have the song Cool. Begins with. That's what it sounds like together. Now, the tritone is right in the middle of our musical octave, right in the middle of all the notes of all the intervals that we can use. So we can notate it either as an augmented fourth going from C to F sharp, or as a diminished fifth going from C to G flat. And composers generally would notate it based on how they are planning to use it. That sounds maybe a little bit obscure right now. All will be explained in due course of time. Moving on, we have the perfect fifth. That's what it sounds like. The picture I've chosen for the perfect fifth is apropos for two pieces. The first one would be Twinkle, twinkle, little star, twinkle, twinkle. First interval of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, as well as the opening to Also sprach Zarathustra by Richard Strauss, better known to all of you, or many of you probably, as the opening theme to the Stanley Kubrick film 2001: A Space Odyssey, and it's played on a trumpet. The first interval is a perfect fifth, and then the second interval is a perfect fourth. Get both of them in that. Moving on, the minor sixth. If any of you have ever heard an ice cream truck go by your house, you've probably heard a famous Scott Joplin rag called The Entertainer, the main melody of which sounds like this. Sure, all of you have heard that, or many of you have heard that. That big leap in there That is our minor 6. You can also look at it descending. If you've ever heard a jazz band play or listened to a jazz record or anything like that, you've probably heard at some point a piece that ends like this. That first interval there is the descending minor 6. Little something like that. The major 6th is the first 2 notes of the NBC chime. We have NBC, NB. That's our major 6th. Sounds like this. Together. The minor 7th. We again turn to the wonderful Leonard Bernstein and West Side Story. If you guys know the song Somewhere, the opening interval, there's a place for us, there's a, sounds like that. Another one from ABBA, for those of you who were teenagers in the 80s, if that applies to any of you. One of their songs, the winner takes it all, the winner. Another example of our minor 7th. Finally, second to last, we have the major 7th. There are not a ton of examples of the melodic major 7th. It's an interval that is just below an octave. And that's actually a good way to think of it. If you think, add an octave, so go from C to C, and then subtract our smallest interval, a minor 2nd, you get our major 7th. It's a good way to hear it. Now, one composer who gave us exactly this way to remember the major 7th is Richard Rodgers in his musical South Pacific. Bally high, we'll call you. Bally high, ba high. The li is our octave, and then we go back down. Bally high. Another musical that gives us the straight up melodic major 7th is the musical that I like to call Beep Yankees, D-word Yankees, a word we're not going to say on the air here. But the opening song of that show, it's a wonderful show, especially if you love baseball and the musical theater sound of the 50s. It's a really, really spectacular show. The opening song, 6 months out of every year, opens with a major 7th. 6 months out of every year, 6 months, like that. The last interval we have is an octave, which will get us back home, C to C. One note to the same note, equivalent, an octave higher. And then we can start over again. Great way to remember this. Picture of Judy Garland as Dorothy Gale in The Wizard of Oz there. Somewhere over the rainbow, somewhere. And there you have the octave. Now,
Hey,
we
Matthew,
have, oh, question, yes.
Well, someone just is curious about what your favorite octave is.
My favorite interval.
Or your favorite, yeah, sorry, your favorite interval. I say octave because we're on the octave.
Oh, man. You know what? I don't know. My knee jerk, and I don't know why. I never thought about this. My knee jerk is to say the minor 6th, and I don't really know why. It's a nice sounding interval, though.
Because it's a major 3rd turned on its head?
I don't know.
All right.
But I think I'd have to say the minor 6th, just purely pulling it out of the air.
There we go. All right, that's all.
All right, so we have our intervals. This is all we have. This is all we're working with here. 12 notes, 12 intervals that that can go between them. Now, the intervals are then put together to create melodies, put together in a linear fashion to create melodies. Just like we have our points on a graph, if we plot several points on a graph and connect them, we get our function, our graph, our data, whatever we're trying to get. When we connect intervals, we get melodies. So I put a lovely melody up here that I think all of you will know, apropos to what we're doing, learning our notes and intervals for the first time. This is, of course, from The Sound of Music, from Do, Re, Mi. When you know the notes to sing, you can sing most anything. All that is a collection of intervals. We start with a descending perfect fifth. When you twinkle, twinkle, when you. We go up a major sixth. You know, NB. We actually even get the whole NBC theme. You know the NBC. Know the is our ding dong from the Westminster chime, our major third. The notes is our minor second, jaws. Notes two, once again, we get ding dong, our major third, to sing happy birthday, major second. I didn't jump over the line, but we go back up a perfect fifth again. Sorry, we go back up a perfect fourth this time. Sing you, here comes the bride. Then you can sing. We start with the same two intervals. Perfect fifth down, major sixth up. Twinkle, twinkle, you can sing and be. But changes up a little bit this time. Now we have an ascending major second. Sing most happy birthday. Most minor second. Anything, happy birthday. We have an ascending and a descending major second. So, little example about how we can take our two-dimensional figures, our intervals, and put several of them together to make a melody. When you know the notes to sing, you can sing most anything. There you have it. Intervals become melodies. Now, I'm going to touch briefly, and then we're going to, because this next topic I'm not sure that we can get through in 10 minutes remaining, but I'm going to touch briefly on where we go from here. We started today with notes, points on a graph, one dimension. Now we added intervals and strung them together, 2 dimensions. Next, we add more than one note played at the same time, 3 dimensions. Now, I mentioned intervals. We can play our intervals either as melodic intervals, as we just showed, or you can play them as harmonic intervals, where you play both of the notes together. Still just an interval. When we add more than 2 notes, when we play 3 notes together at the same time, we get what we call a triad. And triads are the basis of harmony in our Western music system. I'll just show you a brief overview here. The major triad, as I mentioned with the major third, the major triad just takes one step further. This is what defines a sonority as major, what defines a piece as a piece in a major key. Major triad, we can look at it in the context of 3 different intervals. We have 3 notes, C, E, G. And if you see the campfire, again, great way to remember this, Kumbaya. All 3 notes of Kumbaya. If you can sing the first 3 notes of Kumbaya, you can sing a major triad. Major triad has a major third between its first 2 notes. So we have C, E, ding, dong. And then between its upper 2 notes, a minor third. What child is this? And between its outer 2 notes, the C and the G, we have a perfect 5th. Twinkle, twinkle. So when we put all of it together, major third, minor third, perfect 5th, sounds like this. Sound you have heard so many times. Almost every piece that you've heard at the symphony, more than half, certainly more than half of the pieces are going to end with something, a major triad. And oftentimes, you'll hear the major triad repeated several times. Something like that, a big ending of a piece, major triad. Kumbaya. Next, we have the minor triad. Similar to the major triad, except the thirds, the same 2 thirds, the major third and the minor third, appear in reverse order this time. The minor third is on the bottom. What child? Major third on top. Kumbaya, kumbaya. Still have a perfect 5th on the outside. Altogether, it sounds like this. So the darker sounding pieces, the minor key pieces, minor triads, minor third on the bottom, major third on top. The last triad we're going to really commonly see in this period of music is the diminished triad. Diminished triad has 2 minor thirds stacked one on top of the other. What child? What child? Almost like we're about to play Greensleeves in 2 different keys here. Now, putting 2 minor thirds, one on top of the other, means that the interval between the outer pitches is going to be different this time. Now we have a tritone. In the context of a triad, it's going to be written as a diminished 5th between the root, our C, and our G. So minor third, and tritone. So those are the main triads that you're going to encounter in our Western classical music system. And I think with that, if anybody has any questions, I would love to take them now. Otherwise, we will resume with the next step next week.
I always think it's interesting how just like a half step of a note completely changes how everything sounds. I think the best example of that is the major triad and the minor triad, how it's literally the exact same intervals. We just switch the order and it sounds completely different. And I always think that's
completely different.
Completely different. I think this is for we've got quite a range of people here tonight. For those of you who are younger, who you're like, I know all these notes, I know all this. It's really important to know all of this, because as you're playing your instrument, as you're listening to music, when you can hear this stuff and see this stuff, it's really cool to be able to actually know and identify what these things are and what they're doing and what their function is. I always think that's really interesting. It's also really fun when you're just out in the world and you can see, you can hear and be seen and know, like, that's a major 6. Robin says that they know nothing. Well, that's okay. It's okay to know nothing. That's why we're here. That's what we want this for. That's what this, so we're going to be doing this over 6 sessions. We're going to be doing it every other Wednesday. So we're going to be doing Matthew teaching us music theory. And then in between, we're going to be covering another topic in music. We're going to be diving deeper into something. Next week, we're diving deeper into Matthew, and we're asking him a bunch of questions about his life. So make sure to register on Vindini online for that next week. If you want to learn the next parts of this music theory journey, we'll do our second session on July 1st. Feel free to invite people that you think would enjoy this. We would love to have them. Thank you for everyone who is here tonight. I didn't say this at the beginning, but we've got people from a lot of states. We have California, Colorado, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and maybe one other one. I don't, yes, but we have people from all over here, which is super exciting. So that is really great. So if no one has any questions, I know that was more basic stuff, but no one has any questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.